Hi, I'm Nadav Shemer from Mining Journal's Digging for Climate Change, and with me today is Chris O'Brien, Senior ESG Consultant at SRK Consulting, a leading international mining consultancy. Today we'll be discussing decarbonisation strategies in the mining sector. Chris, to start off, everyone talks about achieving, or all the talk is about achieving net zero scope 1 and 2 emissions. That is, emissions directly under one's own control by 2050. For example, the 27 major miners that make up the membership of the International Council on Mining and Metals recently pledged to reach net zero by, quote, 2050 or sooner. I understand from your perspective that you think we should be pushing for earlier.
Well, I suppose it's net zero by 2050 is a great commitment for many of these companies. It's a very aspirational commitment, but I suppose if that's the only target that is being worked to, then we've got a bit of a problem, because the Paris Agreement that was signed in 2015 has this net zero kind of commitment built into it. I think the wording is something like the aim to achieve a balance between emissions and removals by the second half of the century. But even that part of the agreement is not the most important section of it. The most important section is actually two articles before it, which sets these global temperature goals. So that the temperature goals that the agreement sets are aiming to achieve or to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to work towards trying to achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius. And those warming levels are set by science, because if you have a world that's warmer than 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, for example, then lots of low-lying nations like the Maldives will suffer severely from sea level rise, and they might even be destroyed. So the agreement was framed the other way around, basically. It was framed to take the lead from the science and then back calculate what we need to do about targets. And these targets, 1.5 and 2 degrees C, can be directly translated into a global greenhouse gas budget. And that global budget is, in order to achieve a 1.5 degree C world, is about 300 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So if we use that and we map it against what our annual global emissions are, in 2020, our global annual emissions were 40 gigatons. So divide 300 gigatons by 40, and you get about 8 years, which means that from 2020, the target that we should actually be looking at is before 2030. So, if we don't do anything until the 2040s, we'll already be, way too late. I mean, the emissions reductions curves have to be much steeper, much quicker. So it's encouraging that a lot of companies are making net zero commitments by 2050, but really, for what I do as a greenhouse gas specialist, I tend to ignore those, because really the important stuff is going to be, what are they planning to do in the next 5 to 8 years? Because if they don't do anything, then we'll run out of budget.
So you mentioned the Paris Agreement goals there. Could you perhaps go into a bit more detail about where the mining sector as a whole is right now in relation to these goals?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends on, I suppose, on the scale of the operation. I mean, many mining companies have, especially those that are registered in the UK, have had to start disclosing in the last year or two against what's called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And that framework requires that you sort of develop a strategy, and you develop targets to work against, and metrics and targets. But it doesn't sort of go into a whole lot of detail about how you should frame those and scenarios that you should use for mapping out your progress over time. And so what we've seen is quite a range of different approaches being employed by these companies that are subject to this particular disclosure requirement. Some of them are good, some of them are not so great, but because of the sort of because of the lack of specificity within the framework, they're all technically acceptable. But I think, one thing that sort of jumped out at me the last couple of months while looking at a lot of these is that lots of mining companies put targets in. So they might come up with a short, medium, and long-term target, depending on whether they're looking at an organizational goal or an asset level goal. And while those targets, you can meet them, and they may even be based on science, they may, have used international scientific evidence to formulate those targets. It doesn't necessarily mean that the strategy to achieve them is going to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. Because mining is a bit, is structured a little bit different to most other industries. More often than not, you need these step changes, and so whether or not the targets or the strategy that sort of informs those targets is aligned to Paris is another question.
We discussed, I guess this discussion has been around Scope 1 and Scope 2. I have to ask about Scope 3 emissions as well, those in mining companies, supply chains, which we covered in a soon-to-be launched white paper, which you made comments for. What, in your opinion, should miners be doing on Scope 3?
Well, Scope 3 emissions are a bit more of an interesting case, because mining is right at the bottom of a lot of global supply chains, right? And what you tend to find with Scope 3 or influence over Scope 3 is that you have a big influence over stuff you buy, but less of an influence over stuff you sell. So, the mining industry is getting lots of pressure from investors to address their Scope 3 emissions. But really, for most mining companies, that looks like, putting pressure on the people they sell their product to, which is a bit of a rock and a hard place situation. But I think, overall, Scope 3 emissions are throwing more attention at Scope 3 than Scope 1 and 2. Feels like you're pointing out that your neighbour's house is on fire without checking to see if your own house is on fire first. You got to fix the problems at home before you can move on. And I think I'm cautious about putting too much emphasis on Scope 3, because it feels like it's moving the problem elsewhere, or it's sort of delegating responsibility for doing anything about the climate problem to somebody else. And ultimately for mining, that means mostly downstream, and there's a limited amount of influence that you can have on what you sell.